Welcome to the Reaching Up Podcast. I'm Ron Farris.
And I'm Daniel Locke.
And this episode, we are talking about resentments.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us what resentments are.
They are, I think it's more of a, you tell me what resentments are.
Let me help you out here. All right. So according to Merriam-Webster, the old go-to,
there we go.
Resentments are a feeling. You know, we talk a lot about feelings.
Yeah.
A feeling of indignant displeasure or persistent ill will at something regarded as a wrong, insult, or injury. So a person experiencing a resentment will often feel a complex variety of emotions that can include anger, disappointment, bitterness, hard feelings. And those are all feelings that we experience because we perceive that somebody has done us wrong.
Yes. So I think what I was thinking is what it looks like as opposed to what it is. What it looks like for me is when I assume that someone else either knows what I'm thinking or knows what I wanted and has chosen not to respond to that. The story in my head is they know what I want and they're not doing it, which is most of the time not true. Most of the time I've heard said an unspoken need is a premeditated resentment.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard a lot of things like that. I've heard expectations are premeditated resentments 100%. As well.
So it's assuming that they can read your mind, and this does get me in trouble, but assuming that they can read your mind or know what's going on is usually how it starts. And I think it looks like all those things.
Well, that's one of the ways it can start. You know, resentments are like everything else that involves human beings, you know, can be very complicated when you get down to it. Trying to simplify it, quite often resentments are going to be triggered by something. They can be triggered by being taken advantage of. You know, somebody screwed me. Somebody did me wrong. Yeah. Somebody lied to me. Somebody took advantage of me. They cheated me. That certainly is going to probably trigger a negative reaction in 100%. Me that's going to look a lot like resentment. Feeling put down. Somebody has, just talked down to me. You know, that definitely can be a trigger for a resentment. As you mentioned, having unrealistic expectations. You know, I expected more from you. You've disappointed me. You've let me down. That's certainly a trigger. Not feeling heard, being, somebody that talks over you or just ignores what you say. That is certainly a trigger. Power imbalances, any relationship where there's someone that we have to acknowledge is in authority over us, that quite frequently can lead to resentment because you're not the person in charge. You're basically having to do what you are told. And that is a frequent trigger for the feelings of resentment. And then there can be systemic or historic injustices, like racism or discrimination that it can involve an entire culture that lead to resentments among large groups of people just based on the history. Yeah. And we can certainly think of examples of that. So there are lots of ways that resentments pop up. Resentments are toxic. Yeah. They're never good. Never good. No. If we have a resentment, and if you're listening to this episode, I would say the important thing about resentments is to question yourself right now or in the days to come, do I have resentments? And then we will talk today about how to avoid having resentments and how to deal with them if you have them. Yeah. Because I don't know about you, but I've definitely had resentments and I have definitely dealt with them. In my case, a very systematic program designed to alleviate my resentments. And I went from having hundreds of resentments to having none. And today I can sit here and say, honestly, and I really mean this, I don't have a single resentment. And it's because I've structured my life in such a way, I know how toxic they are for me. And I think God has given me some very good helpers, not the least of whom is a great therapist, to teach me how to deal and avoid letting resentments come into my life. And if I successfully keep them from coming in, then guess what? If I have processed the ones I had and got rid of them and I don't let any new ones in, I can say that I'm living free of resentments, which is what I just said.
I can't say I'm there yet. Here's a question I have. Is resentment, do we usually vocalize resentments, or do we usually keep them?
Oh no, resentments can be both. I mean, resentments we can just have it written all over our face. I resent you. And it can come out in the way that I speak. It come out in passive aggressive attitudes or expressions. It can come out in just absolute abuse. I can just attack you because I just resent you so much. It can come out in a workplace setting, for instance. It can come out as lack of production, stymieing the work of others, and negatively impacting, the work environment, trying to actively destroy or, sabotage, something that would otherwise be good because you resent the person that's going to get the credit, or you resent the way it's being done. There are so many ways it can be overt. And then, yes, it can be covert as well. We can keep resentments inside and they will literally make us sick. There are a lot of people walking around who may or may not even know it, that they are so eat up with resentments that they are constantly feeling angry and they don't know why. They're constantly feeling anxious in a relationship or whatever, and they have no idea why. And quite frequently, the reason is because they are harboring toxic resentment. So identifying it is extremely important. Some of the evidence that there are resentments present is that you are a person who has difficulty letting go or forgiving other people. That's a classic sign of resentment. You can also experience just injury. A lot of people talk about playing the victim. There are a lot of people walking around who feel wounded. I've heard it called the walking wounded. They are people who are just walking around waiting to be wounded by someone else. And they're so used to being victimized, they don't know what it's like to not be caught up in resentment and anger and if you will, even at times hatred of other people. And I have met these people. They're around us all the time. And it may be things that they were victims of initially, but over time it became integrated into their personality so that they're not happy, or they don't know how to cope with life unless they are in a constant state of being a victim, which involves typically a lot of resentment. It's always everybody else's fault what's happening to them, and these people are literally everywhere. And
I think it's harder. I don't know. I think it's harder for me even to speak into that because I don't know that I've ever been or maybe I'm not aware of it. I don't know if it's happened. I don't think I've been wrong to the point where it's just something that guiles me to where I can't function.
Good Lord, man, where have you been?
I know. Maybe I think that's where I'm not aware of it. Maybe I'm not aware of it. But there are resentments. But as far as like,
maybe I was fielding all your resentments in mine too, because I have had a bunch. Gosh, that's amazing.
Well, I think it has. The one I'm thinking of right now is the water company we're currently dealing with. Like absolutely
there
wrong.
You go, bingo.
But I think as far as like having someone do something very specifically, repeatedly hurtful, it can almost seem, I don't want it to seem like we're like, well, you need to just, well, and we'll talk about what forgiveness is and what it isn't. If someone has done something absolutely terrible, because my wife being a counselor sees that side of it. And so I guess in my mind, what I'm thinking of is just like little things. I consider them little things that you just deal with on a day-to-day, as opposed to major things that are very impactful to someone's life. And like not a day or a week goes by when they don't think about how this affected them. And so I think you did a good job of saying like, we want people to be set free by the truths that we talk about and by the scripture that we know, and by what we've experienced, I guess.
Well, I agree. And I can talk a little bit about that. So I talk a lot about addiction and recovery. One of the things that I have experienced in dealing with recovery from addiction is the importance of facing up to your resentments. People who work with 12-step programs, the fourth step is to make a fearless and searching moral inventory of ourselves. Now, people who follow that process as it was traditionally written in the original book was the big book, we call it, of Alcoholics Anonymous, was written in 1939, is to start with a list of your resentments. And I did that years ago. When I started that process, I ended up with 40 pages in an Excel spreadsheet. I alphabetized them and separated them and classified them in columns. The earliest resentment that I had went back to 1968. And like, for instance, the first thing on the list of my resentments was AT&T. You know, I had just almost a hatred for the company because I couldn't get a human being on the phone. You know, it was just, there were no help when I needed help. You know, but that was a resentment. It had developed into a resentment. If I heard the words, I was upset just to hear the name. If I had to interact with them, I went into it immediately. My blood pressure would just shoot up the minute I realized I had to call them. And it didn't stop there. Comcast was on there, and it was just, I went through all these entities, like you mentioned, this water company you're dealing with, gas company, whatever. Lots of utilities on my resentment list. You know, everybody that had a automated phone system was on there. But there were hundreds of people and that I had developed resentments against. And what I found out in that exercise, which is why it's designed to be done that way, by putting it on paper, I realized that I had throughout my life been injured, did not forgive, did not forget. And I had carried the pain and the poison of those offenses, either real or perceived, for decades at that point. And I was in shock when I saw it. And I said earlier, I don't have any resentments. I have zero resentments today. I went through a process of dealing with those resentments, and I was able to get rid of them. And we do need to talk about that. Before we do that, I do want to be sure we flesh out, just for people who are listening that maybe are thinking, you know, I don't think I have resentments, you know. If you've suffered, or you think you've suffered an instance of injustice in your life, then, you know, you need to think about whether you have a resentment. If you've ever been humiliated by someone else, or some event that occurred and you were a part of it, a victim of it, then you may very well be experiencing resentment. If you perceive that you are being discriminated against on a consistent basis, you may need to look at that. That may be more resentment that you are carrying than actual discrimination. If you feel like there's prejudice against you, and I'm not just talking racial prejudice, it can be any form of prejudice. You feel like people are out to get you, you know, that's a common thing that you hear, you know, that people don't want you to succeed. They want to put you down. If you're experiencing those feelings, then you probably, those are fueling resentments that you are building up a list of resentments. If you experience envy or jealousy about someone else, you're not delighted to see someone else advance ahead of you. Then you probably may be looking at a resentment somewhere hidden there in the weeds. If you feel like people are taking advantage of you, if your achievements are not being recognized, or you feel like somebody else's achievements are being recognized and yours are being ignored, you probably have a resentment.
And that's what I like about injustice, like being treated. When I say injustice, like I've never had an injustice, I guess. And then when I read the definition, like, oh, do I feel like I've been treated unfairly, overlooked, wronged in some way? Do I feel like I'm more deserving of someone else when they have a promotion?
Yep.
That can lead up to it. So yeah,
absolutely. You know, inability to stop thinking about it, ruminating, thinking about something over and over and over again, and it makes you angry all over again. That's exactly what happens when you have a resentment, feeling a regret or remorse, wanting, you know, being afraid of someone or of a type of situation, or being afraid to put yourself out there and take a risk because you're afraid you'll fail. That could lead to resentments when you watch other people be able to move forward and not be inhibited like that. Tense relationships might signal that there's a resentment. If you feel inadequate, or if you have a low self-esteem, if you can be honest enough with yourself to see that in yourself, then that very well could mean that there are going to be resentments somewhere in your life that you probably haven't dealt with. And then one of the classics is an inexplicable rage or anger. That's almost always driven by resentments.
Insert passive aggressive comments towards someone.
Yes. Passive aggressiveness is just like everywhere for people who are resentful people. And it can really wreak havoc in a relationship, like marriage. That can result in withdrawing from your spouse, being distant, not engaging, criticizing the other person, or being openly hostile, or God forbid, being physically hostile. This happens. Selfishness is another example of the action of resentments. So resentments are all around us. They can be chronic. And before we talk about the solution, I want to say this: chronic resentment, and this has been clinically proven, can also lead to the constriction of nerve endings in your muscles, which can cause chronic low-grade muscle and back pain. Physical manifestation of having resentments now. And then listen to this: long-lasting resentments are so toxic to the body that it can cause the destruction of T cells, which lowers or weakens your immunity system. And you can end up with hypertension, which increases the risk of stroke or heart attack, cancer, addictions, depression, and a shortened lifespan. It can literally cost you time off your life. So resentments are serious. Need to pay attention to them. So let's talk about ways that you can deal with resentments.
You had a very long list. What was your kind of go-to? And I don't know, you don't have to give specific examples, but what's it like when you had to address a resentment of either someone you could get in contact with face to face, or maybe it was a company that had wronged you, that you couldn't really put a face to the injustice, but you were like, I'm resentful of that person. What did it look like for each of those different, or how did you go about those differently?
Well, the first step to me was, and I was following a 12-step program at that point in time, and I was 100% committed to following those steps and to doing that work exactly the way that it was prescribed. So in my case, I made my list of my resentments. And then I took that list and I went back through each one of those resentments, and I tried to determine what my part was in that resentment forming. And much to my surprise, and I've heard many other people say this now that have done the same thing, I was able to see that in almost every one of those instances, I had played a part in the development of that resentment. I bore some of the fault, and in some cases, I bore a lot or all of the fault. But what I did, what I think God opened my mind to see and realize in that process is that look, AT&T, for instance, I'm not picking on them, but they're not inherently evil. I do have a lot of frustration with them because, quite frankly, I resent what I have to pay to have the phone, the service. And then I stopped and I thought, but wait a minute, I subscribe to that service. I have other choices. And so if I am seeking that service, I can't go out and create in that case, I couldn't go out and create my own phone network. So I'm going to have to use somebody's phone network, and all the phone networks are basically about the same. So what I was doing in that process was forcing me to consider, did I have a rational, reasonable basis for that resentment? And in every single case, the answer was no. Now, in those cases where people had hurt me or offended me, I had to look at those a little bit harder And I, in almost every case, was able to find where I had done something, I had some part in it, I had done something to escalate that situation, or I had started the situation by doing something that was not right or not acting honestly or honorably in some way. And I definitely, as I looked at it very closely, I was able to see that, yes, I had a part in making this happen. And so just, if you want to say it this way, amazingly, magically, I stopped thinking that these entities and people were inherently evil. And I realized that they were just, that the situation had developed that I had a part in. And if I factored out my part, there wasn't nearly as much to be upset about. And that process took a while, because like I said, I had 40 pages. I had an Excel spreadsheet, going back to 1968, and I had to work through those one at a time, and it took a while. Yeah. But I came to the point to where I eliminated them one by one, because as I was honest with myself about my part in it, and I had to admit to myself that I had fallen short, and that I had been, in some instances, if you want to say it this way, the perpetrator, the one who really started the problem to begin with, and that I was just harboring the resentment and characterizing them as evil, so that I didn't have to focus on the fact that I had made a mistake. Yeah. I became more honest with myself. I became more accountable to myself, and in the process, the resentment just sort of melted away.
That's very encouraging to me to hear that.
It's the truth. I wouldn't be telling you this if it wasn't true.
And I think if there's
I'm free of them today.
That's good.
Free.
Well, I think if there's something I'd add to it, is if it's been the part, and you said a lot of figuring out what is your contribution to it. And I think I'd want to speak to someone who it's not their fault. Something's happened and is 100% not their fault. And so I think there's a couple things, and you mentioned them in there, and I want to make sure we catch them, is the being honest with ourselves, but being honest with ourselves of that someone did hurt you, or that it was not your fault and it happened. But knowing that while others' actions can influence you, like, we're responsible for how we respond to them, whether they're our fault or not. And I think there's a couple scripture verses I'd like to read. Sometimes we have them, sometimes we don't. I think Paul does a good job of explaining a couple things. And so for those of us that subscribe to the authority of Scripture, I think there's a couple of these that kind of impact me. And there's one is in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. He mentioned in chapter 4, he says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger. Bitterness, rage, and anger, I think, summarizes resentment in a lot of ways. Brawling and slander, so talking bad about people, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ God forgave you. So understanding, and I think that's what helps us, because for me, like, I feel like there's instances where, like, it's not any power of my own to forgive someone, or I'm thinking about something terrible that's happened, and there is no way physically that you can forgive them, and I don't think you can. I think there has to be a work of the Holy Spirit and God enabling you to forgive them because of seeing how His forgiveness, and then with that, it kind of goes with the Romans 12. I like this verse a lot. And I reference this one, but it's, do not repay anyone evil for evil. And someone said, an eye for an eye makes the world blind. And I agree with that. And so do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, and here's the part that I love, if it is possible, as far as depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So it doesn't say that and so I think in those verses, what I don't hear is, forgiveness is not condoning their behavior. Forgiveness is setting yourself free from whatever control that situation had. It's releasing your responsibility in it, because you have said it was my fault, or it was not my fault. Hey, I'm gonna forgive this person. It doesn't mean we condone it. It doesn't mean it was okay. It doesn't mean that because you forget, it's not a forgive and forget sometimes. Sometimes things are not forgettable, but you can forgive and move past that, and then it won't impact you as much.
Yeah, I've always heard that, and I think this is true, that resentment is drinking the poison, but wishing the other person would die. Whenever you look at forgiveness as a concept, Christ taught love first and foremost. And one of the greatest acts of love is to forgive people who don't deserve forgiveness. Yeah. Jesus looked down at the people who were crucifying him and prayed that God would forgive them. Yeah. And he said, because they know not what they do. Yeah. And he said to us when he taught the disciples and all of us to pray to God by the Lord's Prayer, he said, forgive us our debts or our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Yep. And, forgiveness is essential. And the cool thing about forgiveness is, the other person, if they don't deserve forgiveness, then forgiving them anyway is truly an act of grace and love. But it may not benefit them at all, but it does everything to heal us. Yeah. And the fact is, and the programs that deal with 12-step programs teach this religiously, resentments, according to the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, resentments are the number one offender. They put more people in a state of failure in terms of the ability to live a healthy and happy life, free of addiction, than anything else. Resentment, it says we must deal with resentment or it kills us. That's what the book says. And that's a great point in our spiritual life, which, the scripture is just full of references to the need to forgive and to live at peace, and to love other people. You can be the kind of person, I can be the kind of person who is just eat up with resentment and just sees myself as a victim and I'm afraid to do anything because I might get hurt. Or I can be that person who just lives a life that magnifies the love of God. I'm a vessel for God's goodness to pass through me to other people. And that is not a pipe dream. That is a reality. And in order to be able to be an open channel of blessings and love toward other people, I cannot have resentments. I just can't do it. And I think when I started the process of dealing with my resentments, I thought that was pretty much impossible. Forgiving people at that point in time was probably, I thought, an impossibility. But I've done it. Yeah, I've done it, and I can't say enough about the importance of it. There are a lot of people who talk about ways to deal with resentments, but one of them is that we have to identify the source of the feelings of resentment that we have. We have to quantify that. It certainly helps to start with a list. Just write down everybody that you seem to feel a resentment toward. Write it down and take a look at it. And then we have to develop a new way of looking at that situation. I mentioned that in my own practice. It was looking at my part in the situation and looking at it for what it was. I'll give you a great example of this. You hear a lot of people who resent their parents for the way that they were raised. And it can be one of a million things. But the way that you make peace with that is to say, and I watched a man who bitterly hated his mother because she was an alcoholic. She was a raging alcoholic. She was an angry, evil, mean person to him. She treated him and abused him. But it was killing him. It was killing him. It had ruined his life. And he was able to overcome that because he was able to deal with that resentment. He forgave her. And I heard him say this one day, and he was crying when he said it. He was probably 75 years old. He'd lived most of his life in anger and denial and alcoholism. But he was sober at that point. He died sober. He said, I realized that with all her flaws, she did the best she could at the time. And he was able to make peace with that, and it set him free. She had been dead for years, but he had to make peace with it. And forgiveness is that gift that God has given us that sets us free from the poison of resentment. And it works, absolutely works. A couple of other things about dealing with resentments, forgiveness, of course, is a huge thing. Reframing that situation for what it really was and not what we turned it into by ruminating it over and over again in our minds, which we tend to do very well. Sometimes we have to actually have an act to tell that person that we have forgiven them, or to write them a letter, or to, somehow or the other make it known to them that we have let the offense go, or maybe write the letter and not send it, but just get it out there. These things can really mean a lot. And then we get to live on the other side of that resentment, like I am now, where it's gone. And I'm going to tell you, if you got resentments, get rid of them things. They do you no good. Yeah. All they do is destroy your ability to be everything that God intended for you to be. They're going to hold you back. They're anchors on you. They're weighing you down. They're going to pull you down no matter what you do until you deal with them effectively. So let's hope that the folks who are listening can start that process of doing that.
Absolutely. And then the serenity prayer will end with this one, I guess. Mm-hmm. I like the serenity prayer because it's this prayer is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, which is what you talked about. Courage to change the things I can. So doing what we can do, and wisdom to know the difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really respect that. And that will be the last word on resentments. Mm-hmm. Thanks for listening this week to the Reaching Up podcast. We appreciate it. If you're on YouTube, be sure and hit that like button for us. Subscribe, tap the bell button, and you'll be sure to get our next episode. If you're listening on Spotify, iHeart, or the Apple Podcast, be sure and follow us. Rate us on Spotify, if you will. Like us on iHeart or any of the services, and leave us a comment. We definitely read those and appreciate it. Check us out on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. And if you want to reach out to us and communicate with us one-on-one, we'd love to hear from you. That email is contact@reachinguppodcast.com. That's it for this episode on resentments. Thanks for listening.